I'm Aron Pilhofer. I am the James B. Steele Professor of Journalism Innovation at Temple University in Philadelphia, and a former, and now I guess recovering bridge rollist? Bridger. There you go, that's right. And we're going to define that in a minute, but I want to welcome everybody here. We have a fantastic panel. We're going to dig into some really meaty issues, and based on how many people are in this room right now, I assume I'm not the only one who has had a job like this. These three here certainly have. So actually, I want to start, we're going to do introductions, but I want to start with Federica, who was really the inspiration for this panel. She wrote an amazing piece in Neiman Labs during their annual predictions, for their annual predictions feature. And I think just like totally put her finger on something that not only has been present in journalism for some time, but is actually a very big and growing trend. So I'm going to turn it over to you to sort of introduce this.
Thank you. I am Federica Cherubini, and I am head of knowledge sharing at Condé Nast International in London. When I wrote the piece, I didn't mean to define bridge roles. I kind of came up with it. And what I was thinking, there were so many roles in newsroom and in news organization that keep evolving, new ones that come up all the time. But there are a lot of roles that are very difficult to define because there are a bit of a lot of things, and especially if I think of my role, for example, so I work, Condé Nast International regroups 11 Condé Nast companies around the world, everything outside the US. We have offices in Mexico, China, Russia, India, and how was the business set up for print? They're all completely independent companies. And so my role is kind of sitting in between and enabling connections. And by that, starting from that, I started to think there are actually so many roles that sit in one department, but actually are in charge of translating, not languages, but cultures and mindset. And I think we keep talking more and more about them, not because they are new. I think there was always someone in the newsroom that was used to do a bit of something and a bit of something else. But because we talk so much about cultural change and changing mindset, these roles usually are enablers of cultural change and mindset. And they just speak they can speak product, they can speak engineering, they can speak commercial, they can speak editorial, and sometimes they just put together people in a room and call for a meeting and say, oh, we should all talk about this. So that was the beginning of the piece.
Cool. So Lam, why don't you introduce yourself, and then Rebecca.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lam Vo. I work for Buzzfeed News, where I am a reporter mostly, but I do all kinds of things to report. I'm a developer and a coder who can get data and does data analysis using data from the social web. That's my main specialty, but I also tell stories in anything from an animated GIF all the way to a data visualizations. And sometimes when they like my story enough, they put me on a live Twitter show. So I'm not quite sure what my job is, but I think it lends itself to all of that.
Rebecca?
Hi, I'm Rebecca Quarls. I'm with the News Revenue Hub, serving as their Director of Client Relationships. And so basically what my job is to do is to help work across teams, whether it be editorial, engineering, product, and design, to get everyone to build camaraderie around a common goal, which is the final frontier in reader engagement, in my opinion, which is membership. And so that's going to be helping folks, for-profit and non-profit clients, understand how to optimize their email, site, social media, and audio products to serve the readers and to ultimately engage them enough to where they're compelled to put their hard-earned dollar behind it. Some of our clients include PolitiFact, The Intercept, the Marshall Project, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking, the Marshall Project, The Intercept, The Lens down in New Orleans, and Voice of San Diego, and very, like I said, about 16 across the country.
So let's start talking about job titles and what we actually do for a living. during my time at the New York Times, I was both on the, I was part of the technology team, but I was also in the newsroom. And I ran a technology team in the newsroom. We called ourselves editors, but they were really developers. So let's talk, so you are the head of knowledge sharing. Describe what you do and how did you get there?
So I think I got there because I'm obsessed with media and how media works and what happens behind the scene and structures and workflow. And I started just studying and going into newsroom. I was working for the Reuters Institute in Oxford, producing reports on how the industry is changing. And I was just very curious, and I kept talking to people with new job titles. I did one report on editorial analytics, and that was the time where audience growth editors, engagement editors were the new cool, fancy titles in the newsroom. And so at Condé Nast, no one has ever been called head of knowledge sharing. It's still to be defined exactly what it means. Mainly, it means that I'm in charge of thinking about the ways we work together and the ways we communicate together. So I basically in between strategy, operations, comms, and I float around. And so I was, for example, I roll out. Before we stop, I'm part of a new team in London, which is a central digital team that is tasked with working and developing a digital strategy across the 11 companies. And before, there was no need for all being in one platform to be able to communicate. Emails, easy. But of course, because the directories are not joined, even knowing who's who and who's doing what and what projects are going on was really difficult. So, for example, I roll out Slack across the 11 countries, across editorial, commercial, product engineering, everyone. It's an ongoing process, not there yet, to try to make everyone communicate better. And a lot of it is basically community building around, it's community of peers around the company, the people who work in the same area. So if you work in data and analytics in Japan, your colleague is not just the person next to you in the Tokyo office, but everyone who works in data and analytics across the Condé Nast company.
Right. Rebecca, you also have a very interesting journey to your current role. In my time, I always described what I did as being somewhat business curious, a journalist who's really interested in what goes on the commercial side. Talk a little bit about your background and how you ended up where you are.
Sure. So prior to being at the News Revenue Hub, I was working at the Texas Tribune, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan online news organization that's focused exclusively on covering public policy and politics for the state of Texas. And so my job was to manage the membership program there. And when I say membership, just so that we're all on the same page, I'm talking about donations or contributions from individual readers. And so that's going to be making up for organizations I work with now or at the Tribune, a sizable chunk of your annual budget and your overall plan for sustainability. And so you have to work very closely with your editorial team, because the more that your membership is tied to the core product, the better. And the core product is the content. And so that's going to be helping a reporter feel more comfortable to do a Q&A with members after they've rolled out their latest investigative series, or getting an editor to be the voice and sort of the face behind your latest sort of membership pitch that, again, is going to be aligned with some of the timely, topical, and compelling content that you're putting out there. And then prior to that, I was working at NOLA.com and the Times-Picayune down in New Orleans in my home state of Louisiana. And I was part of that wave of, that first wave of like audience engagement roles. I was a community engagement specialist, which like when I took the job, honestly didn't know what that meant. So that meant at first not only managing the social media presence for the sites, but also working with a team full of traditionally more print comfortable reporters get get to a place where they were comfortable in a digital-first environment. And so that requires, I think most of us working in the news know that newsrooms are great at telling other people's stories. We're actually not very good at telling our own or being our own PR people. And so I was sort of like a cheerleader for each individual reporter and kind of helping them like get more comfortable with being accessible and imageable across our site and to the audience.
And just to stick with this for a second, what your job is at the News Revenue Hub is the sort of thing that traditionally you wouldn't be recruiting somebody with an editorial background for that sort of thing. What's intriguing about that role for you, and how do you think your editorial background will help you in this role?
Yeah, so traditionally, I think roles like what I'm doing would be someone that's got a pretty stacked fundraising background or development experience, and I actually don't have any of that, or didn't have any of that whenever I got started. Editorial has served me because, again, you've got to be able to speak the same language as the team and make sure that when I talk about having a marketing or a membership program that's aligned with your core product, that also means it has to be aligned with your editorial mission and in a way that doesn't make reporters and editors and designers feel icky. And so I'm kind of like trying to always suss out the ick factor and make sure that we're doing things that feel right by each of our clients. And that is actually different for each client.
Right.
Certain clients are comfortable, reporters at certain newsrooms are comfortable voicing a fundraising appeal, others are not. Certain newsrooms are really comfortable conducting like a live chat with their readers, others are not. And so it's kind of different on the journey. And so I think having the editorial sensibility to understand when to push and when to really just like work with like where they're at in that moment.
And so, Lam, why don't you talk about your journey too? So you have a deep editorial background, you have a deep nerd background, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like to describe myself as the woman who does everything but the main thing that the organization does, which means that in many ways I always had to explain and advocate for my role's existence. Like at the beginning, okay, let's go through it. I was a multimedia producer and the editorial lead for videos in Asia for the Wall Street Journal, video for a newspaper. I was the visual journalist and at some point made props for a live show for a radio station's podcast, right? I was the interactive editor, so someone who was using code to tell stories and find stories for a television station, Al Jazeera America, and now I'm this like bizarre hybrid that does. I'm a reporter now at Buzzfeed where I specialize in social media data, but I've also in the process become someone who helps consult when it comes to like how do we investigate this story on the social web, as well as someone who educates people in the newsroom. That's actually my sort of side hustle in many ways. Education and proselytization is one of the biggest things that comes with these bridge roles, and for me, telling the story of like why you need this and how it can be helpful has been like being a salesman on some level has been just as much of the job for me as like telling the stories well and selling through exemplary work. Because if you come to the table and are like, here are 5 projects that I want you to look at and get jealous of and want to emulate, that's probably the best sales pitch you can make in an editorial newsroom full of journalists who are incredibly suspicious of anything, let alone their colleagues, on some level. And so, yeah, that's my evolution.
Cool. So we're just going to play a little game here up here, and I invite you all to participate by the end of today, and we can do this during the Q&A. I think we should establish a list of some of the most ridiculous job titles that nobody knows what they are. I mean, we've already heard a fairly good smorgasbord of them. My own, I would throw into this mix car reporter. So in the U.S., computer-assisted reporting, that's what we called data journalism years ago. But it's a very recursive name because the R in car stands for reporter. So you're actually a computer-assisted reporter. Anybody? Car reporter. Yeah. Anybody else want to throw some more ridiculous titles you might have heard?
I've heard of futurists in residence.
Oh, futurists in residence. That's a great one.
What else?
All right.
I feel
Well,
like,
we can.
I mean, and it's becoming more part of the nomenclature, but like chief innovation officer.
Oh, that's a great
you know?
one.
And,
Yes.
and it's like that. It means everything and nothing. All
Right.
at once. I don't know.
Right,
So-
right. CIO, CPO, CMO, CRO. Just throw a C in front of something and you've got a new job. Yeah. So staying a little bit on this idea of culture and why these jobs exist, I'll throw a toss-up question for anybody. Talk a bit about that. That a lot of times these jobs are created because there's a perceived void or gap or need that the person who creates the job or the organization that creates the job can't always define, which leads to these ridiculous job titles. But there's a definite need. So let's hire someone to fix this problem. Has that been successful in your experience? Where has it worked? Where has this not worked?
I think for me is like, no, I don't think every organization should have a head of knowledge sharing. I mean, it's not. I think it made sense when Wolfgang Blau created it at Condé Nast because how our company is structured and because we needed to start working much more closer together. And so some of the things that were in my job description were valid for like 6 months. And then when I started, the agreement was, let's keep trying, let's keep moving. And now I think if you ask my colleagues what I do, you probably get 20 different answers.
Right.
Because I'm kind of do a bit of everything, as you said. Like often I just see something needs to be done, and I start doing it, and it then becomes a project or becomes something that needs to be solved. And a lot of times is about, best practice and sharing what we're doing to avoid reinventing the wheel 11 times for us in 11 companies, but in a lot of cases just in the same office. So I sit in a lot of meetings, a lot of calls, and I just basically listen and then say, oh, but you talking about that, actually that project is happening similarly over there, you should talk. And that kind of thing that's why I think it's really difficult to define, because how do you define that?
Right.
And how do you measure that? A lot of what I do is internal community building. How do you measure how successful you are with internal community building? Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of the things that, because the culture of a team and organization is in evolution constantly, I think few of the things that I'm doing now, maybe in 6 months, they won't be needed anymore.
Right.
I think, having worked in large organizations that are very old, I think the Wall Street Journal is 125th year now, right? And organizations that are like Buzzfeed that came out of nowhere, and 2 years ago they started something called Tasty, and that's paying all of our salary now, right? Coming from an organization that grew organically over time into its own little silos and fiefdoms, to understanding that is an organization that needs those roles more than, let's say, BuzzFeed, that was founded on flatness and everyone kind of does what organically comes to them in some ways, is something that's been really hugely influential in how I think about bridge roles or what it means to be in the newsroom with a skill set that few other people have and a mindset that few other people have. And so in many ways, for me, it's about proselytizing one person at a time. Mm-hmm. And I liken it to the movie Rogue One, like the Star Wars movie, where you kind of build a revolution from below. You get one person after another who adheres to the same principles and to the same philosophies, and through success, you can hopefully get other people to come along as well. Because there's a lot of old structures that, similar to a house of cards, if you pull out one, they all kind of collapse on one another, and so you can't apply the same role to different kinds of newsrooms. And I think, again, for me, it's one person at a time, and when there's enough momentum, you start having a startup within a large organization that then does something that's really incredible and potentially becomes a model for the overall organization to follow. Yeah.
And as we know, revolutions are built on hope. So on that theme, no Rogue One fans here, really. It's the second best Star Wars movie ever made. I don't know what's wrong with you people.
We got each other.
Continuing that theme, a lot of times these jobs are created by someone who perceives a need, but it's a bridge role in some respects to nowhere. where there's sort of hope that maybe this person will figure out whatever needs to be figured out. The person who hires, tell me if this, and obviously this resonates, the person is hired, and then the boss kind of goes, okay, check, moving on. Talk about, have you experienced that?
I think the issue is that kind of what you're saying, Lam, like, I feel like bridge roles up to this point are sort of a sign of the times for the evolution of our industry. In a way, like, Lam, it sounds like you are, and some of the skills we're describing, and I think you guys probably by being in this room have them too, is as a bridger, you're curious, but you have a deep enough skill, not like, you're not a jack of all trades, you're actually a master of a lot of trades. You know how to edit video, you know how to manage social, you know how to write, you know how to report, like, you know how to, you're kind of front and behind the camera, behind the CMS, like at an event. And so I wonder, that's been, for me, at least personally in the past, in my experience, like where I got hired somewhere and they weren't really sure what I was capable of yet. And then the role evolved as my curiosity and talents gravitated towards a certain thing. And then after the fact was told, like, upon departing a place, they were like, we weren't really sure what we wanted until you, like, showed us. Right. And so that was, like, obviously a compliment, but also that can be deeply frustrating for people in bridge roles because, as you were saying, the path isn't there for you. Right. And like, that curiosity is not always, like, rewarded.
Right, right. I mean, let's talk about the challenges there and who are the kinds of people who succeed and who are the kinds of people who fail. And I would throw out, certainly the people who succeed are not the kinds of people who need to be told what to do. Is that a fair?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think when I started, there was, like, a lot of my job description is so vague right. that it could be so many different things. And so I think there is a quality of being, like, proactive, don't stop, because you sit in between. Very often I have little ownership of project. I very rarely, I'm able to say, oh, we're doing this and we're doing this now, because it's all about bringing in one department and the other, and then the ultimate decision sits with someone else and someone's budget, so it's not mine. And my job is convincing, bringing them along, showing them why. When I started with Slack, rolling out and communication tools, it's something that sits with IT and the tech support team. Right. So why me? It's because it was not just about the tool, it's what we do with it. Why do we use it? Right. And across the teams, and what are the rules of engagement of that specific tools, and that all kind of like, I made it up.
Yeah.
And I think to add to the point of the self-starter, sure, you have to be able to be like, no one's giving me direction, you know what, I'm going to run with it. But you also have to be really good with your tactics, because you're constantly battling what your boss considers success and what you consider success, right? And that success is measured in a number of metrics. So for your boss, depending on which organization you are, let's say you're a nonprofit, you care about awards because that gives you money from funders. You care about changes in policy. You care about maybe some exposure in the change of compensation. If you're a for-profit company, maybe you care about traffic. You care about making a brand out of yourself and becoming known for something else and so on. Those are all metrics that your bosses have. And then as someone who's in a bridge role, oftentimes, as someone for myself, it was always like, I want to change stuff. I want to get my mom to care about subjects that I cover, not like just drive-by traffic, right? And I want to make sure that the stuff that I do is high quality, right? And how do those two align? How do I game their system to get what I want to get my success? Those are the things that you always have to do when you're like that odd one in the newsroom who doesn't do what everyone else does. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I'm curious, we have a lot of people here. Wow, more people. How many people here would say they are in or have been in a role like this? Okay, boom, there you go. Yeah.
Bridgers unite.
Bridgers unite. Yeah. Exactly. Yes. Exactly. What's the best advice you could give somebody who gets into a job like this? What's the give some pro tips. Rebecca, do you want to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
Pro tips. Okay. I think it is something that's on a bridger, and something that came up in your article is that inherently these positions that we create for ourselves are sort of irreplicable. And I'd say fight that urge to make yourself irreplaceable. I think that, okay, for me personally, at the Texas Tribune, running their membership program, what I was thinking about over the course of the few years I was there is like, how do I make this membership program sustainable and replicable by anyone? And so, and something you've talked about too is in terms of design thinking and engineering is like, document your work thoughtfully and considerately. Think about the people that are coming after you. Leave breadcrumbs. And so I'd say that, well, of course, I want to be indispensable, to whatever organization or whatever boss I have at that time. Like, I'm really trying to think about, like, how do we formalize processes when and where we can? Like, how can we make it less than this secret sauce? Like, you're equal parts, like, curious and good at this and good at that. There are ways to make this something that someone else could come in and do after you.
I would say listen, because the reason why you're there is to gather different needs and bring them together. So you have to be proactive and know what you're doing, but if you just go on your own and you just in the void, then there is no need for that and you're failing in that first role. But also, we all talk about cultural change and sounds so fascinating and fancy. Often cultural change is incredibly boring and starts from very, very small things. Right. I discovered we have 4 or 5 documents. They're all kind of a version of the same thing, and they all have different information. I just compile everything in one document, and I made a process for which everyone who's changing or updating goes through that. Boring, super boring, but that was needed, and that enables something. I think a lot of the things that these roles enable are the things that are very difficult to point. Right. And I think when we were talking about challenges before, sometimes you wonder, okay, what have I achieved today? And if you list a task of boring things, oh, that was an exciting day. But then at the end, if you build one after the other, hopefully, then you're not irreplaceable because you've built the process and you build something that's there for everyone else.
Right.
I think what both of you are kind of hinting at is this idea that you can take 2 paths in these roles. You can take the isolationist path and be like, this is us versus them. And you are not giving me resources, so I'm just going to start succeeding but not giving you any resources, and then you start having these internal clashes. Or you can take the communal approach, as you said, and figure out a way of okay, how do we uplift everyone regardless of whether I'm here or not? How do I document and leave a trail and leave a legacy so that this is replicable, something that developers love doing? And then, and how do I build a community within but also outside of my current employer? Because oftentimes these bridge roles have been instituted in different places, and different organizations can help you learn from their mistakes as well. And there's plenty of Slack channels and conferences and organizations that help bring this knowledge together from a global, but also from a national standpoint, so that we can all learn from one another.
Great. Yeah. So start thinking about questions, because we're going to leave a big chunk of time at the end for that, and ridiculous job titles. I definitely want to hear that. Let's actually. I want to take a small step backwards to talk a bit about culture and stay on that theme a bit. A lot of times in these bridge roles, particularly the ones that combine some form of technology, they take on these almost mystical characteristics that, you become a data guru, you become a code wizard, and I think, and in my experience, a lot of times that almost, you don't want that, right? I'm sure you've had that experience. Right?
Be careful what you're doing good at.
Yeah. How do you deal with that? Because there's a tension there between being part of the organization and trying to do what you were just talking about, and also being separate from it, right? Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit how you handle that.
Education. I'm big into, as I said, I've been teaching people for 10 years, inside the newsroom and outside of it. And for me, a big part is like, this is not rocket science. I had to teach myself. I'm not that smart. You can do the same thing. And in many ways, it's building on small successes. I think over time, the wizardry comes in when people look at what you have learned over the course of 5 years and are like, I could never do that. Right. But if you then show them how to sort a table in spreadsheets and they're like, oh, I can do this on my own. Or you set up a scraper on their computer. Or you even just explain the ecosystem of how web languages work and how you can use them to investigate your own stories. Right. That in itself builds this like idea of everything is doable. Yeah. And I think that makes it less of a specialized skill that no one else can touch. I actually freaking hate that when people are like, oh, you can't do what I do. And I call it the programming world, there's a lot of like harboring of knowledge and speaking in jargon that is intentionally exclusive and makes it really difficult for newcomers to come in. I'm actually writing a Python book for beginners so that other people can do it. It's going to be free online, so go get it. But so that other people who I think could deeply like benefit from the skill set I have can learn that. And I think that's part of the demystifying it, making it accessible to everyone else.
That's actually a great word. I was just going to ask that. How much of your jobs is demystification?
I mean, I think I am the contrary. Like, I am the generalist. You know, I work with data, technology, commercial, editorial. They are the specialists. They have all the knowledge. So I sit in a lot of calls where I always understand enough to know what's going on, but then when they go into the deeper, that's not my job, that's their job. And my job as a generalist is actually just enabling that sharing. So a lot of the things I do is coming up with ways that internally in the office we share and showcase what we're doing. Yeah. You know, everyone has like town hall, etc. But like we have something called show and tell, where I go and suggest that people from different departments, every Thursday come and present what they're working. You know, it's not my knowledge and it's not me, like just me to know everything. Like a lot of the time you become, sometimes I say I'm a person version of like, let me Google that for you. Like just ask her, she will know. Like, no, it's yes, but also it's there and you need to know this too. And so just enabling people to share more and to own their own successes and their own stories.
Right. Rebecca? How much of your job is demystifying?
Demystifying. I'd say, so the News Revenue Hub has a tech stack, and that is sort of like the bread and butter on which that, like any of the advising that I'm doing to clients is built on. And some of that's going to be like Salesforce, for example, is the CRM, Customer Relationship Management tool that we use. And so whenever you're working with a new client who maybe feels pretty uncomfortable with the back end of like, how am I going to like find part of our email audience that hasn't given in the past 2 years or has never given ever, like I find it easier in terms of the demystification, like instead of teaching someone an entire dance, like teach them one song. Mm-hmm. So like the Cupid Shuffle, like let's teach you one song and then you'll learn the rest of hip hop dancing as you go. So I don't know, I guess just like, I mean that would be the case for anyone probably, but like how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time?
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. I've never heard that phrase before. That's a good one. I'm definitely borrowing that. Moving back to the organizations, in my experience, I've seen, well, actually, let's talk about the evolution of bridge roles. Fede, you talked about this in your, sorry, Federica, we're friends, and I said I would not call you Fede, and I screwed up. I screwed up. In your piece, you talked about sort of the evolution of these roles, starting from, data and then moving up through product. Can you talk a little bit about let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing, like how these roles are evolving and where they're evolving.
I mean, I think they're evolving in a way that they've very much been, as you said before, very linked to the person in the job. that does the job in that specific way. By being irreplaceable, is that, you know, it's a weird combination of skills, of things, like who else, if you leave tomorrow, like who can do what you do? And I think the evolution is making them a bit more structure. And then, you know, the counterpart of that is that how do you make structure a role that needs to be flexible? That's a bit of like unknown, I don't have an answer. But I think the evolution is thinking more of where do they fit, you know, even in an organization, in a big legacy organization like Condé Nast, like our team works very much in a agile way and we're very flexible, but at the end of the day, my role sits on a budget line on someone's department. I need to belong somewhere because that's the structure an organization needs to have, and I think it's going to be more and more helpful, and more people are talking about that, for the organization to be able to recognize that, yeah, sure, you sit there and you have a boss, but your role is being in between, and so how much we will be able to adapt that structure to allow for a bit of a mess.
So let's talk about disciplines. So I think you pointed out the data probably was the first.
Yeah.
And how do you think how do you see it evolving in terms of disciplines that are now moving into the newsroom skill sets?
I mean, audience and audience growth is probably one that everyone's talking at the moment. You know, it was very much a marketing thing. And now, because the focus is so much on the audience and on membership and on engagement, it's actually editorial. I think, you know, the data and the coder, like, let's bring developers in the newsroom, which was very much a thing a few years ago.
Right.
Like, does it make sense to have strict labels of who does what or...
Right. Do either of you want to jump in at this point, Rebecca?
I think one of the things that I've just learned from starting with building Flash interactives,
Right.
you were part of that,
Yes.
all the way to like building JavaScript data viz, and now going back to static things, is that change is constant, and that in many ways there are things that will go there are things that will evolve. Technology, the way in which we consume information. Back maybe 5 years ago, only 30% of our audience was on mobile phones. Right. Now it's like 75, maybe even more. In places like Myanmar, it's 100%, right? And so you're looking at an evolution of where people get their news from, and what kinds of information they're willing to consume. Video, if you think about it this way, we used to do documentaries that are 7-8 minutes long that no one watches anymore, right? Then we went on to teaching our audience to be able to watch just clips of raw footage, and now we have the Netflix revolution of documentaries. Like, all of this stuff, the format keeps changing. What I think stays constant is story, quality of content, and quality of information. And those are, if you understand that your main goal as a journalist is to inform your audience in a way that allows them to make responsible decisions, then everything around that just needs to kind of like figure itself out. Yep. Whether it's through a data visualization, whether it's through a video, an animation, or text, I need to understand what my main goal is. It's to inform a specific audience in the best possible way so that they can make responsible decisions. Based on that, I will be like, okay, to inform my mother who lives in Germany and speaks 4 languages, but mostly Vietnamese and German, I will make this type of thing, and I will adapt the mode and the medium that I use to target her to her. And I think that's been what's changed. We went from I'm just gonna put everything out because I have a monopoly on what gets published, to what is my main goal here, and let's adapt our technologies and our roles around it towards that person.
Rebecca, even setting a goal for a newsroom is a relatively new thing, right? Talk a little bit about how you approach your clients, and how, coming from the editorial background, but also coming from with a sort of a business sensibility, a business side sensibility, how you try to get them to understand how this needs to work.
Sure. So most recently, I think it's really, really useful to like be able to come with the data that like if you can work with me and our team on setting up an automation whenever a new subscriber hits your list, like we're seeing other clients do this, and it's coming to amount to X amount of dollars per year, and getting them to connect the dots between like those dollars could go directly back into investing into another reporter. So like really just coming armed with the data, and that's like just takes time. I'd say in the past, historically, what's been more challenging is working in news orgs where goals are very much imposed from like a corporate overlord, and like your job is to help a team of reporters meet like engagement metrics that feel really arbitrary. Like you need to drop a poll in a story at least once a week. You need to comment X amount of times on the site. Things like that felt arbitrary to the reporter, and then also kind of arbitrary to me, where that as a bridger is challenging when like the key metric by which your success is being evaluated is whether or not people take your advice. And like they ultimately report up to an editor as they should, but like they have no onus to like really want to work with you.
Right.
So,
exactly. Yeah.
I've seen it work, and then I've seen it not.
It's like shuttle diplomacy at times, right?
Yes.
Yeah. One more, and then I'm going to open for questions. Calling them bridge roles is great because it's a bridge to something else, right? I mean, by definition, it's a transitional role. By definition, it's temporary. At the Times, I watched as we evolved away from a discrete, separate, what we used to call the web newsroom. And these were people who basically owned the CMS and the entire digital production process. And now those people were folded into the newsroom. They have normal editorial titles. That operation, as a separate operation, is gone. It was very painful, very controversial, but a necessary evolution. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of these roles to actually the point of, maybe the point is extinction?
Because my team is myself,
We don't
want
want
to
you
argue
to go
for
anywhere.
like
No, you're
my
good.
own
You're
extinction.
Good. You're good.
But no, I mean, a lot of the things that I do is starting something. I kick it off. I started Slack. I put it into a place where now it's rolled out more or less across the company. Now sits with technology, and I move on to something else. What's difficult is from a more there is a organization level and a personal level. On the organizational level, I think is exactly keep evolving and keep adapting, just like being ready to reset. I mean, I set 6-month goals and then see every time I reassess, like, are they still good? Yeah. Should I move on? But from a personal perspective, what's difficult is what is my next job going to be? Like, you know, how do you know what you, because there is no career path, figure it out where you're going, what you're going to be. It's very difficult. But maybe because, you know, 2 years ago I never thought I would apply for a job. It's called head of knowledge sharing, and then it appeared and it was weird enough to be intriguing, and so I think there is a personal side that you have, and then goes back to the skills, you know. Never mind how do we call it, never mind where do I sit. I know what I'm good at, and I know I'm good at like connecting and translating people, thoughts, and putting process in place. What does it mean? Where does it sit? Now it sits in this department in this time, but I would not keep doing something internally at Condé that there is no need. My objective is making the thing I'm doing not needed anymore.
Right. Actually, you mentioned something that I wanted to touch on also, and then I promise we will open for questions. And that is a career path. That there is no, by definition, there is no career path. And this is usually solved by adding titles, you know, so senior, chief, deputy, you know, audience edit, you know, and then a little bit more money. And you're laughing because you know I'm right. Is this a problem, or is this a good thing?
What is a problem?
Is it a problem that that these roles, almost by definition, don't have a career path?
I think that is, again, goes back to like career path is on you, but on them. And so the on you part is going to be, if you are going to be a bridger, you have to work on moving those wins out of a space where it's like at first they let you dabble with a small team and a little bit of resources. You have to make those wins pretty big so that those wins then turn into leadership thinking that these wins should happen more often, and this should become a shared responsibility across an organization. And so that's been, for me, whether it be like, hey, engineer, like, look how many like donations we're getting from the homepage now that you redesigned that widget, to reporter, like, look at the donations that came in based on this timely topical pitch that we wrote around your latest series. So again, like, part of that is on you, making the wins feel shared and then growing from there. And then part of it is going to be on the organization that you're at. And I think that part is, I've gotten to places in the past, and I'm sure you have too, where you realize that bridge roles or just those sort of transitory roles aren't being thought of at the leadership level. And therefore, if they're not being thought of, you start to get to a place where you're being asked to replicate a certain skill, and the teeth cutting ceases. And so as soon as the teeth cutting ceases, that's when, for me personally, in the past, I've started to look up and look around and try to ask, like, where will I be able to find opportunities for advancement and more challenges professionally? So I don't know if that answers your question.
Totally does.
And I think basically the economy and our industry has just changed. I think we went from thinking, like, let's say 50 years ago or so, people would get one job and work their way up in the company. That was the same way in the from GE, whether you were an engineer, all the way to like journalism. You would start as a news assistant, become a reporter, then become an editor, and so on. I think there's something that's changed with basically technology and how information travels and how our economy is becoming increasingly global, and there is this beauty in like finally stopping the idea that you need to have that one path and accept that change is constant and to continue to roll with the punches. Again, I was a video producer, an animator, a writer, then became a developer, then a data journalist, and now I'm just doing kind of like what I think makes for the best stories, right? And I think that is an important thing to remember. There are values that stay constant, and there are things that will change. But as long as you know what it is, what your ultimate goal is, what you in yourself consider success, that can be your North Star, as everyone else is like changing their minds about what the newest tech fad is at that point in time.
And Aron, if I can add one thing, and it's going to sound very cheesy, but like the support of a network. I recently attended the Online News Association Women Leadership Accelerator. That's 25 women working in digital journalism with very similar challenges, very different jobs, but you know, a lot of when I wrote the piece for Neiman, you know, it wasn't supposed to be defining bridge roles, but so many people said, yes, that's been my career for so long. And then looking at the job title, we had nothing in common. We came from completely different backgrounds, different experiences, and yet there is a room of people that all said, actually, I had that problem too. So it's a lot about learning from each other and the support of a community. You
had different jobs, but also kind of exactly the same job.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So let's open for questions, and if you can wait before you, but there's a microphone out there somewhere that is now being delivered. Yes, go ahead.
I really like Federica's framing on listening. I wonder if another, maybe not so ridiculous job title could be Chief Listening Officer. I'm curious, if you were looking to hire a bridge role, are there like personal, like character traits or personality types? Like what are the strengths that you would try and look for in somebody to be a bridger? Is there a shared set of traits?
Empathy? What do you guys think? It's just like understanding that there's different perspectives in the newsroom. Everyone feels, everyone has their own narrative going on, and understanding that just because I think data is the best thing in the world to like bulletproof your nut graph doesn't mean that everyone does, and like figuring out that it's about listening and it's about communicating on some level is
And
important.
it's about curiosity. Like a few years ago, still, and in some organizations still, like the journalist is like, oh yeah, but it's not my problem how the organization makes money. Well, like if you start by saying, yeah, but that's not my problem, well, that's already like half of the problem.
Cool. By the way, Chief Listening Officer is an actual thing. And I think we have actually, unless somebody comes up with something better, that might be the most ridiculous job title. So we might have a winner here. Great. Other questions? Yeah.
Hello? Yeah. A very interesting panel, first of all. I really like the approach of sharing information across the company, setting up goals for newsrooms and all the stuff, and putting everyone together, looking at the same goals. My question is related with data. How important do you see data democratization, basically, across the organization? So I know that reporters and writers, and editors, they write and they want to inform people, but then you have the chief executives that are focused on KPIs and goals and revenue. How you connect that, and how would you say your organizations right now, they share the right information to these writers, and do you feel the departments are aligned?
And you mean data with analytics, right?
Correct.
Like views and stuff like that?
Yeah, any KPIs, yeah.
I'd say that up to this point, what connects us all in wanting to work in editorial is that you want your work to be shared with the widest audience possible, and so that it can therefore hopefully have the impact that you dream it will. And so yes, you have to be really thoughtful about how you convey that to reporters and editors in a way that doesn't, and basically what I've been working on is reporters and editors are helping me understand these are the big lift pieces that took a lot longer and took a lot more resources and investment of time and energy and analytic and analysis than say the short list style piece that took me no time at all. And so I think that instead of just making it obviously that short list style piece on a major news item of the day did better and you should keep writing stuff like that, I'm constantly trying to assess what are the things that you're most proud of and how can I help find the audience for it, or if if we do that consistently and we can't find the audience for it, how do I have a conversation with you where it's this doesn't seem to be working, but I think that we can reframe some of this. I don't know if that's helping, but using certain analytics to you need to be armed with data anytime I'm having those types of conversations. It can't be a subjective argument that I think that your listicle about puppies is good and your article about city council voting on this is bad. Yeah. That's never my intention.
Yeah.
I think it's a very thin line to tread, because you can tell a reporter your story got 50,000 views and that's maybe baseline for the organization, and you can tell them now this one got 200,000. That could start this cycle of people trying to hunt for clicks. And I think what's very much more healthy is the idea of as you said, measured in a way, what kind of information do I give to you at some point? And it's one of many metrics by which I measure your success. So as a reporter, or as an organization, is it about, again, your story should have exposure, that's traffic, so data goes into that, but do you also start measuring data around laws that you change? Do you start measuring data around conversations, anecdotes of people changing their behavior based on your story and so on? Those are different ways of getting at the same thing. So it's not just about the data that's low-hanging fruit, like Google Analytics, and half of that stuff is kind of spam bots and whatnot anyway. But it's also about understanding, okay, what is the ultimate goal of this publication, and does your goal align with that? And so sharing metrics can be helpful, but just do it in a way that understands that sometimes a story gets a lot of attention because it has puppies or it's in the news cycle or not, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't deserve more attention. Does that make sense?
I guess the last thing I'd say there is just in working with the news organizations that we do now and previously at the Tribune, it was decided, strategically by the organization or by most of the ones that I work with that membership, not page views, not unique visitors, not whatever metric is the latest and greatest by a third-party decider, is going to be the metric by which we evaluate our success as an organization. And so membership is very much, members are folks that feel so, again, compelled by like the content that you're proud to produce. And so I think not only just like the metrics itself, but thinking about it in terms of impact of your work, like you're saying, like let's figure out organizationally, strategically, like what do we think success means?
And that's so damn important.
And I would add why. You know, you can have like a bunch of targets and KPIs, but I think what we've done at Condé is explaining why that is our KPI, what is the objective, and it's not just, you know, we have a data and insight team, and then we have an audience team that sits in editorial. They work very much together, but, and, you know, the data team will pull out the report and the figures and the spreadsheet, and then the audience team explains the narrative, like why that's important, why you want to get there, what does it mean. And often we show just examples of like one team is doing something really good, and that is, you know, what you will get if you start doing that specific thing is that result, and why is that important.
Yeah, and just to add to that a little bit, to cite one example, it's not just why are you doing this, or what is a success, but also why are you even writing this in the first place, right? Why are you doing this story in the first place? So Chris Moran, the brilliant Chris Moran at The Guardian, was on a singular mission to reduce the amount of content The Guardian produces on a daily basis. And that's how he sort of approached it, was just asking, why are you writing this story? You know, not just coming and bludgeoning someone over the head with a spreadsheet, but what was in your head when you wrote this story? What are you trying to achieve? And actually, in some cases, found out the only reason reporters are writing certain kinds of stories is so that they don't get yelled at in morning conference. If they happen to not, you know, write that Tesco earnings piece of, I'll put it, journalism, you know, and that's just not a good reason to write. And it turns out like they wouldn't have gotten yelled at, or maybe they would have. But you know, this is where, again, to go back to something you were talking about, Rebecca, the need to have this sort of these sorts of roles sitting in the newsroom. There's no way that someone from the marketing team or the audience team on the commercial side could come in and make that same case. Just no way. Sorry, I didn't mean to get on my high horse there. It happens. Other questions? Way back there. Do you have a microphone? The microphone is making its way. It is raining, and I forgot my umbrella.
I feel like we're holding y'all hostage because it's raining.
Oh, no, they got nowhere to go. Nobody's going out in that. Go ahead.
So you've been talking a lot about bridging between different roles that are close to the primary process in news organizations. But you also said something about sustainability and making it replicable. Yeah, replicable. Can you say something about bridging to other parts of the organization, like HR or an internal academy, or because I think there might be some resources there in like a bridge role. But.
Yeah.
So I think your question is like, how do you bridge not just within the editorial team, but like bridge beyond? Sure. Okay, personal anecdote. Whenever I was at the Texas Tribune, it was a volunteer-based committee, but it was a diversity and hiring committee, and it was our HR team had sort of called for volunteers. Anyone from the organization could participate, and folks that are probably more bridge-minded, you know, are the hand raisers and did participate. And so that role, you know, that was at a critical time where the state of Texas, the demographics of the state are rapidly changing, and the main question to solve for was, how do we make our entire news organization more reflective of the people that we're covering? And so in terms of like replication there, I think that's where like tapping outside of your existing network is going to be critical, and talking to other folks who have tried stuff and creating, again, like documenting thoughtfully and intentionally and leaving breadcrumbs was sort of the like goal of the project. It was the goal was like document best practices from across the news landscape, but then also come up with a statement of purpose for the organization, and then to come up with like practices that we're going to change or policies that we're going to enact because of it. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
That's an anecdote.
Yeah, stepping out of your role.
Yeah,
Stepping out of your
yeah.
yeah.
Just be a hand raiser. I don't know. Just like step outside of editorial and go like knock on the door of whoever else you're interested in maybe learning from.
And in my experience, the people who are like in bridge roles are a visionary, creative, but maybe that's the stereotype, but those people are normally not so good in documenting. And
Right.
Is that something you recognize? Or?
Sorry, no, because I don't like repeating myself, as like, everything I do is kind of like a Medium article or something that's documented somewhere so that I can pass it on. Like, I very much believe in modular documentation so that someone, like for example, I've organized a bunch of hackathons, and I have always been proud that 50% of my hackathons are women and a third are people of color. That's because we recruit in a certain way, and we have a very specific way of doing that. So putting that documentation out there so other people can replicate and learn from the same methodologies is something that I feel very strongly about. I think the community increasingly feels like that. I've been doing a lot of work with women and people of color when it comes to understanding how much they make versus how much other people make. And so that, again, is documentation that is out there that we are all actually coming together to write. So one of the organizations that's doing a lot of work in that realm is the Open News Community. They have a blog called Source, where they put out a lot of blueprints, I call them, that other people can use to replicate their successes. They are all about showing their methodology and making sure that everyone can follow the same things, and they same sort of like pathways, and they recruit from different networks to have those folks do similar walkthroughs. Here's how anything from here's how you start a news team, all the way to here's how you ask for more money during a salary negotiation. And I think that comes from a shared frustration of not having those resources. And maybe that's a new thing. Yes, we're all creative and maybe hopefully brilliant, I don't know. But, but I think because we are all coming into organizations and are facing the same thing over and over again, more and more people are actually putting that into real, like, replicable posts and resources. Yeah.
And the example on how this does happen outside the newsroom and how you can do that. So we have, when you start at a company, we have a buddy system. So you pair up with someone. That someone does not come from your team because you're going to get to know your team, going to work with them anyway. It's from another department. And that person is responsible for like showing you around and like checking in on you for the first week. And that's, it's down to personal involvement, so some could be very good and some can not be super engaged, but like it's a way to making people know each other from different departments and then kind of starting developing and making growing a relationship between people who work in different areas.
Yeah, it's a great question because I think if there's one area that hasn't really seen a sort of a bridge role, it hasn't been part of the growth in bridge roles, it's HR. And anyone who's ever worked in a newsroom knows the term newsroom manager is an oxymoron. Everyone knows that. I mean, management is not something that is valued. And that's why newsrooms look like they do, to be quite honest. Other questions? We have time for maybe one or two more.
Or if people are stuck, I don't know.
Yeah, I think
Or if people are stuck, we can ask.
Yeah, right up here.
we're all going to stand up and do a sun dance after this.
Yeah, this is bad.
My contribution for ridiculous titles is Chief Collaboration Officer.
Oh my goodness, yeah. You got some game there, that's good.
I'm curious just to hear maybe from each of you about what failure in a bridge role looks like. We've talked a lot about successes, but like, what's the dark side? What does it look like when things go wrong?
Yeah, I think failure is when it's all too often that, at least in the audience.
Whoa. That was somebody who leaned on the, right? Yeah. Okay.
The dark side.
All too often, I think that, again, personally, in terms of audience growth, engagement, and ultimately conversion of some kind, that work can be seen as other or optional, and so therefore you were seen as other or optional, and so I think that, and as you guys know, just in the technological upheaval of our industry, that like a lot of what I'm doing or asking others to do is seen as like ancillary or not as truly like baked into the editorial workflow. And so it can make you feel like you're on an island sometimes, unless, again, like you figure out how to make the value proposition that you shouldn't be. And I have not always gotten that right, so that would be failure for me.
I think a company is only as good as the people who work there, and failure for retention is a huge one. I think there's one thing when you launch an experiment and that fails, but you learn something from it. I still consider that a success. But I hear over and over again, especially among like women and people of color especially as well, where really smart, really capable people are being put in a position that the overlords, Lord Sith, think is a good placement for them, and then they leave within a few months or within a year, or aren't used to the best of the capabilities. And that keeps happening over and over and over again. And that's the thing where I think people need to pay attention more. It's not about getting people in the door. It's not about having the smart people on like the placard at some point. It's about retaining them and figuring out a way of growing with them. And I think that's the beauty about like teams that you really enjoy working with. You will see that loyalties nowadays in an ever more fragile journalistic environments, loyalties lie with people, not with brands. And you will see that people will leave and take with them the best people if you can't figure out a way of making it work, and if you can't change with them in some ways.
Someone told me that you don't leave a job, you leave a boss.
Yes.
That's a good
one. But then I think failures is running around in circle a lot of times, developing best practice guide that no one is going to have a look at, because a lot of the bridge role is suggesting and coordinating and not having an ownership of something sometimes is frustrating, because you've done all that work, it's there, you've talked to everyone, and then the decision sits with someone else, somewhere else. And so what you can do can have different degrees of like effectiveness. I think you always need the buy-in from someone in the management to know that you're doing something for a reason, not just because you're doing something that day.
Yeah, I'll toss one in. And actually, it's the opposite of the three people to my right. You've heard a lot of words today like sharing, like lifting everyone, like demystifying, like trying to, making my job essentially obsolete. The opposite of that, and I have run into people like this, and I'm sure you have too, are people who jealously guard their special knowledge and their special secrets in complete fear that one day their job will be obsolete, or that they will be left behind. And that is failure, utter and complete failure. And I'm sure we've all seen situations like that. Probably have time for maybe one more quick question, if there is one. Yep, over here.
Hello, really enjoyable discussion. I guess I kind of two related questions. One is, are bridge roles going to be around forever, do you think? Is it something that's a phase that organizations are going through, and that in the future there's a better, more optimal way of running things? Is it a part of the pattern of change in news organizations? And then I suppose the second part is, to what degree is there overlap between product management, product ownership, agile processes, and all that kind of stuff that goes with building, full stack teams or whatever it is? Are those things part of that shift into the future, and how do bridge roles kind of evolve in the future?
To the first question, I think that I don't think bridge roles are gonna go the way of the dodo. I don't think they're going to be completely extinct. But I do think, and you're seeing this happen at news orgs across the U.S. at least, that like you have your mix of specialists, and you need those folks that are deep knowledge, deep subject matter experts, whether it be on a certain beat or whether they're really great front-end designers. Like, you're always going to have those specialists, but I'm seeing more and more investment in news companies in professional development, to where that reporter does know how to cut a video on the fly, can like conduct a tweet storm, to where hopefully you'll see where professional development, would hope to see that be a double down on investment in newsrooms, to where like everyone becomes more of a bridger. You get, and like if you want to, but like everyone can become more of a bridger. You'll still have your subject matter experts, and you'll have to have a couple of people that still can speak the language of everybody.
Yeah.
But I think in some way I agree, like the role of the bridger will kind of always be, because the industry is not going to stop changing, and so that will keep just rolling on. But organizations can adapt in some ways the structure to a different and more agile or like flexible way. Like our teams, product and engineers, UX, they all sit together in the same area. They're cross-functional team. They work on different projects, but they're all mixed up all the time. And they all then they do belong to the product team, to the engineering team, but it's just basically one big team.
I think it also depends on the size of the organization. I've seen a lot of startups be very nimble, like a little speedboat that can move around really quickly, but then you have, as an organization grows, you do need to have communications between different departments as people specialize and so on. So I think it's, as you said, it's a mix of people becoming more willing to learn different skills, and then having sort of on a spectrum of like amateur to expert, having like people on that sliding scale go up and down. And so some people, as teams get larger, sometimes you do need someone who's like, okay, that person knows this, this, and this. This is how we concoct the perfect A-team to tackle that story. And so I think working with other people is probably the hardest thing to do. And so figuring out a way of like making that sustainable over the growth period, or like as organizations grow and shrink, is going to be something that's always going to require, maybe it's a luxury for some organizations that don't have that kind of money to have a role that does that. But maybe it then becomes like an outsourced service that you deal with a consultant, someone who comes in and helps you do that. Or maybe it's someone that you can have in-house. But I do think that there needs to be something that brings people together.
But you can also, like our editorial team has a group of people that varies all the time. It's called Creative Collective, I think, where everyone, they have their own job, but they meet once every 2 weeks. And they can pitch projects or stories. And even if you are a Snapchat producer, but you have another skill you're not really using daily on your job, you can contribute to the project. And the teams and the composition changes all the time until they produce something and then they go on. So like it's a way to channeling different skills and different attitudes into producing something.
We totally forgot the second half of your
Yeah, I was just going to say it was about product, but I am trying to remember what the question was about product. We have about 1 minute, so maybe we can. Okay, great. All right.
I thought we were over this whole time.
No, we're good. I want to first of all, thank all of you. This was terrific. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Done.
Did it.
Now how do we get
Stay here until the next panel.
Right?
If only there were ice cream. We can eat it here.
Sorry.
Please, everybody can leave the room.